Welcome to My Life. We're pleased to have with us Dr. Charles Williams. Dr. Charles Williams has been practicing medicine around these parts for 61 years. He's currently a psychiatrist at the Community Mental Health Center in Lapeer. He's a 1945 graduate of the Oxford High School, and he's lived in the Oxford area all his life. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on our program.
My pleasure.
Yeah. First, I'd like to just start talking about the Community Mental Health Center in Lapeer and what that's all about and why it exists and your role there.
Well, the Community Mental Health Centers were all started by John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, 1966 to be exact. And at that time, there was such a shortage of psychiatrists that they set up the centers so that there would be a place that could be referred the various problem people. For example, if you'll go to a center today, there's psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists, and a complete team of healthcare workers that weren't available before 1966. So now, when someone has an emotional or a mental problem, can be referred to the center. They'll sort out the kind of problem it is and then try to establish a treatment program for them so that they have some direction and establish goals and be treated for whatever the problems are. And they range all the way from children to oldsters, from developmentally disabled to serious mental illness to perhaps the lesser anxieties to severe depressions, and the general problems of living with life and the problem that occurs as a result of stresses, that is to say depression, anxieties, can't cope, and of course one of the serious problems, as you know, is suicide, and many times suicide is the result of ongoing severe pressures as well as mental illness.
Unfortunately, it seems like either these problems are growing in our society or else we're just seeing them more. I don't know which it is.
Well, I would think probably a little of both. Certainly our life has become more, shall we say, sped up. It's faster, much more pressure. Certainly the children today, even in my own family, I look at my children, they're all pretty well established, but I look on to grandchildren, and even though they have some educations, jobs are difficult, establishing families is difficult, finding adequate jobs with adequate incomes is difficult. And so these are all pressures that take their toll on people, and the result is fatigue, don't sleep, tired, depression, and then perhaps fall into the drug scene, which has been certainly a growing problem. And if there's a growth in anything, it's certainly drugs. Go back to my own high school, it was a big thing to have a beer or a cigarette. Now today that's pretty passé. Now we're into heavy drugs, we're into really serious problems, and the numbers are huge. It used to be, in my days again, at Oxford even, used to call the group that had difficulties the bathroom group. Well, that's where they get together to have a cigarette, or maybe the high school dropouts, because they couldn't drop out to 16, so they're waiting to 16 and drop out, which they did. But they're the ones that very often had the social problems. So.
Yeah. Did you ever go to Toledo for 3-2 beer?
I never did.
That's the closest thing to drugs I can remember from. Of course, I'm from Monroe, but
Same
going
problem,
to Toledo for 3-2 beer.
And when we were growing up, it hadn't, and we don't know why it's so pervasive through the whole society. We have wealthy people into drugs. We have poor people into drugs. There doesn't seem to be any common denominator as to why they might be. It's just that it's so prevalent, and they are into drugs.
You know, Indian, you probably heard this over and over again from your grandparents or your parents. Boy, I'm glad I'm not living in their generation. And we're beginning to feel the same way about our offspring, aren't we?
Yes. Every generation has their own music, their own culture, their own friends. And and it's certainly changed. I always look at music. I don't like the new music. Why? It's not mine. It's theirs. But they don't like mine either.
Well,
so every generation has their own music, their own culture, their own clothes. But again, if I could suggest, the moral atmosphere certainly declined, shall we say. You know, we have a huge growth of unwed mothers. We have a huge growth of problems among the teenagers. Just one of the things that struck me, I was reading one of my medical articles, STDs, that's sexually transmitted diseases, among 12 to 24-year-olds, it was like 65%, which means our whole moral climate has changed considerably from my generation to the present one.
Yeah.
I think it's all part of all the change, the drugs, the looseness of moralities, and
I like to tell my kids there is practical reasons for the 10 Commandments.
Oh, I had a lady with her daughter in front of me one day, and I just happened to comment, there's really nothing much happens after 11 o'clock. Why wouldn't you be home? And she kind of pouted because she didn't want to be home by 11. But again, what's going on after 11?
Well, so many kids are on their electronic devices after 11 these days.
Oh, that's, yeah. When I grew up, we didn't have a phone until I came back from the Navy. I was 19.
Yeah.
That was the first time we had a phone in the home. We did have, when I worked on the farm, we did have a party line. Rang twice for us. But then I remember went to the rotary and then to the touch phone, and of course now to carrying around the world in your pocket, literally. I'm sure all of us got one in our pocket.
Sure. Well, listen, there's so much ground I want to cover with you, but one question I'm dying to ask you is now, you were a general practitioner. In fact, you established a clinic in Lake Orion and had that for, what, 25 years or so, and then decided to become a psychiatrist. And this was back in, what, the 1970s when you made that decision?
Yes.
Explain to me how that came about.
Well, lots of things happened. As you know, today medicine is very fractionated. I have 3 different doctors myself for my personal reasons. You probably have 2 or 3 of your own. And up until the 70s, whenever anyone had a problem, they immediately started with their own doctor. And if he didn't do it, he would send you out. So pretty much the family practitioner was the center of practice. And also at that time, they were pretty active. They would do obstetrics, they would do fractures, they would do surgeries, they would do minor surgeries, and so on. So and house calls and a general wide array of services. But then in the 70s, the malpractice climate became so bad in medicine that you had to narrow your focus down to an area of medicine. For example, you go to your own doctor today, he will not do surgery, he will not do a baby, he will not do a repair, he will not do a surgery. He does an examination and then will refer you to whichever place you want. Many times people refer themselves directly. So the scope of medicine has been split out. But also at the same time, every specialty has become much more sophisticated. The amounts of information and the electronics are in medicine as well as every place else. And the sophistication of, for example, a heart valve. My wife had valve replacement. Today they'll run it up your arm, put it into place, pull it backwards, and the valve's in place. And they go home.
Well, miracles never cease.
But that's an example of the sophistication that's happening in every specialty.
Sure.
That's cardiology. You're having the same thing in gastroenterology, same thing in endocrinology with diabetes. There's a tremendous change. For example,
we're gonna. Can I just interrupt you just briefly, because we've got to take a break right now. But that's a good point for us to pick up on when we return. We'll be right back.
Hi everyone. Don't forget you can purchase DVDs of your favorite shows from OCTV, whether it's Minutes by Minute, Our Community Access, or Connie's Kitchen. Just call the station. Our number is 248-628-9658. Enjoy watching all of our shows on OCTV.
Back with Dr. Charles Williams. Dr. Williams, you were talking about the different specialties of medicine, and you were starting to talk about something to do with diabetes. You want to continue with that?
Yeah, diabetes is a pretty prevalent disease along with hypertension. Often say that's what the primary care physician does today, is do diabetes and hypertension and refers out to various specialty things. But diabetes is very interesting in that it first started out replacement of insulin. You know, diabetes is due to the loss of beta cells in the pancreas that can't supply insulin, and so it's supplied by a shot. And then along came the pills that stimulated the pancreas to supply diabetes. But then they found that the liver also is involved with diabetes, the kidneys involved with diabetes. It's found that if you're severely overweight and have the bariatric surgery, often get a cure of diabetes.
Really?
Now, why would that be involved? That's the bowel. So here you have the pancreas that we know about. Now we know the liver's involved. Now we know the kidney's involved. Now we know the bowel is involved. Now that's a tremendous increase of sophistication of just one disease.
Right.
High blood pressure is another great example. My father died of a severe stroke because they couldn't control his blood pressure. And even when I started medicine in 1954, we had no drugs, and I mean none, for hypertension. And I had patients with 300, 350 blood pressures, and they, of course, all died. And you autopsy them, and the kidney was just blown apart. It was just a mass, no organization left to it at all. And of course, they found out that really the kidneys are the reason for high blood pressure, not your heart. Now, as in medical school, they taught us forward pressure, forward failure, and backward failure. Forward failure is when they got swelling of the legs and that, and backward failure is when the lungs filled up. And they thought it was due to the heart, but it turns out it was due to the kidney. All your blood goes through the kidney every 15 minutes. So if the kidney starts to resist, heart has to pump harder. Well, that means your blood pressure goes up.
Right.
And if it goes up too long, it'll destroy the kidney and also cause heart failure. So it's a whole procession of things. Well, then in 1955, I happened to be part of the Ford Hospital program that developed Diaril. And that was the first antihypertensive drug we had. I had to take blood pressure on a lady lived up by Metamora and send it to Ford Hospital on a monthly basis. And they were treating her with Diaril. She had pulmonary hypertension. And so that was the first drug. And then, of course, from then on, we now have maybe a dozen very effective blood pressure medications. But again, now it's involved with the kidneys, the heart, the whole arterial system, and so on. So again, everything has become more sophisticated as we learn what's going on.
So you chose psychiatry.
Well, in 1972, when all of a sudden can't deliver babies and set fractures and my practice being limited, then I had to make a choice on what area I really want to work in. Do I want to stay in the general practice office and take care of high blood pressure and diabetes and coughs and colds and whatever else comes that way? Or should I look at, could I do this into my old age? And well, now that's a little bit strenuous, although at that time we're still doing house calls and answering the phone, and I didn't know that it was going to go to much more controlled, the emergency room. You answer the phone, the doctor tells you what to do, but he doesn't come see you. But it was all changing.
Sure.
So I had to make a choice, and at that time I was over at Oakland University working on my bachelor's degree, which I had never picked up before I went to medical school. And I was doing cultural anthropology, you know, that's Jane Goodall and the chimpanzees. Sure. And this kind of work. So it was very interesting on behavioral kinds of things. And so then the practical things, well, what could I do? Well, I looked at radiology. I have a nephew that's in that one, and very successful and kind of interesting. Pathology, which I like, that's looking at disease processes. And then psychiatry, and of course, psychiatry was kind of a offshoot of the anthropology that I was doing over at Oakland University.
Well, now, none of those is easy, but I got to say, just guessing, psychiatry was probably the toughest of the bunch.
Well, I could go to Clinton Valley as a resident, which was within driving distance, and still could moonlight some in the office. So from a practical standpoint, I had lots of children in college, so I had to talk to my banker about financial assistance for those 3 years till I could get the residency done. So then I went over to Clinton Valley and interviewed over there, and of course I got accepted, and so I was able to work and also apply a specialty.
That's great. Let's talk about your life in general. Now let's go way back to the early years. Where were you born?
I was born in a little town, we often say the last town in Oakland County, and that's Leonard. It's directly north of Rochester, 14 miles, and it's east of Oxford, 9. So it's up in the corner of the Oakland County.
Did you live in Leonard until you graduated from high school, or?
Yes.
Yes. What did your
Mm-hmm.
father do there?
My father was, he had an 8th grade education, but was a handyman. When he built our house, he did the carpentry, did the electrical, did the plumbing, and he worked at Ford's as a skilled tradesman in pipe fitting.
He did all that. So he worked in the auto industry, and he built your home?
Well, he worked, Ford was originally at Woodward Avenue and 6 Mile Road.
Mm-hmm.
And when they moved from there to River Rouge, he was living out in 13 Mile Road in Woodward, and he wouldn't move to River Rouge. So he came out to Leonard and bought a small farm. He grew up in a farm in Minnesota, so he came out and bought a 15-acre farm and then 10 acres of orchard.
Well, he still had a ways to drive to work, didn't he?
Oh, he quit.
He quit and just,
quit.
okay,
Yep.
and farmed.
Yeah, when they moved to River Rouge, he wouldn't go to River Rouge.
Was he born in Leonard?
No, my father's from Minnesota. He was born in a little town south of Minneapolis, and his father was born in Guilford, Connecticut. So we're, I guess you might say, Connecticut Yankees. So
you go back quite a ways as far as your family goes
on my
in
father's
this
side,
country.
clear back to the 1600s.
So we're talking Mayflower time.
1640, 1660, 20 years after the. I never could find beyond the grandfather that came from Rhode Island down to Connecticut. He was an ironmonger, which would be blacksmith, and I can get back to him. Now on my grandmother's side, we can go back to North Ireland in the 1400s.
So did your family basically come from the British Isles, all of them?
All of the, my father's family, my mother's family are all German and Polish. They came in the mid-1800s like the other immigrants did.
Okay, and you had an uncle who was pretty famous in the Civil War.
Oh yeah, my grandfather's great-grandfather's brother was a general from Michigan. He was in the Civil War. He was with Sherman on the March to the Sea from Atlanta to the sea. And in fact, he was in charge of the 12th Corps when they captured Atlanta, when the Union soldiers captured Atlanta.
Okay, very good. Now, okay, so you grew up in Leonard, Michigan. Now, tell me about the farm situation that he had there. How many acres did he have?
He only had 15, but he also had a truck, and he would do odd jobs with the truck. He would haul things to the market. We raised tomatoes, 5 or 6 acres of them, and sold them at the Eastern Market in Detroit.
We're going to take a brief break right now, but I want to talk more about that when we return. Okay? We'll be right back.
Canine Stray Rescue is Oxford's own local dog rescue. Call them at 248-628-0435 or go to their website dogsaver.org and click on the Canine Stray Rescue League link.
We're here with Dr. Charles Williams. Now, you were telling us about your boyhood experiences on the farm. Tell us more about it. You guys took your goods down to Eastern Market, is that right?
Yes, and all of the local people did. My neighbor across the street, and you'd go down, and pretty much the whole area would be down there every Saturday. Particularly Saturday is a big day in the Eastern Market, and that
was a major distribution point, wasn't it? Even today, all the big restaurants buy from there and so forth. But tell us how it worked with you.
Well, whatever we were raising, and basically we raised tomatoes and melons, and one of the stories, of course, I remember two ladies, tenant ladies, came down and says, "We've been waiting for you," and my father said, "Okay," and he sold them the whole truckload if he would deliver them, and so we went up on the east side of Detroit to an Italian neighborhood down an alley. And the lady says, "Now I want 25 over here and 10 over here," and they had bought the whole truck in the neighborhood, and they had sent the two ladies down to get the tomatoes and have them delivered.
Yeah. Now, did you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, I have one. Well, I have two. My father was married 3 times, and his first wife lived 10 years, and he had one son who was 28 when I was born, and then he married again, and she died of heart failure. And then my mother was only 18, and he married again. So I have one brother from her and a sister. One sister dead now. My brother was an engineer at Chrysler for 30 years. He's an executive vice president of something.
So there was quite a, I mean, your father was well into his 40s, almost 50 when you were born.
53 when I was born.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, he was born in 1874.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me about your experience on the farm. When did you get involved with the hands-on of working on the farm?
Oh, you grew up with it.
Did you?
Milked cows and planted tomatoes and planted melons and plucked melons and raised corn. And we always had 2 or 3 cows. You know, that was before I had milkers, and you had to get up and milk them every day. And so I grew up as a farm boy, basically.
So were there a few days where you had to get up early and do some chores before school?
Every day, including Sunday.
What kind of stuff did you have to do?
I had 2 cows to milk every day, morning and night.
Ah.
And if I didn't, my brother did, so it was one or the other. But basically, when we got to high school, I went to live in Lum with friends to go to Emily City High School, because my father didn't want me to ride with other student drivers to Oxford to school. So I spent 1.5 years in Emily City, and then my last year in Oxford. And then my brother, the same thing. He went off to Denby High School in Detroit, and then spent his last year at Oxford also. But by then the bus system was all set up, and they consolidated Leonard, Lakeville, all of the little towns, North Oxford.
See, folks didn't understand we had school of choice way back then, right?
Oh, yeah. Leonard was an unaccredited high school, so that meant anyone that was going to high school in Leonard, if the school would accept you, you could go. And my brother went to Denby, I went to Emily City, and then eventually went to Oxford. All of the Oxford students were actually schools of choice, but then they incorporated them into the consolidated system.
Emily City was a bit of a ride for you, wasn't it?
I lived with friends up in Lum, if you know where Lum is.
I do not, but so you lived away from home during the week, is that right?
Yeah, for 2 years. Mm-hmm.
Wow, how'd you like that?
Oh, I did. They were very fine people. They were old friends of my mother and father, so yeah.
So you'd go home on the weekends and plant tomatoes?
Well, that was all when I was younger.
And milk cows.
Yeah.
Okay, so what grade were you in when you came to Oxford to go to school finally?
Senior. I spent
senior in high school?
Yep. I was living with a family up in Emily City, and it didn't work out well. And my father said, "Oh, you can come home if you want." So I did, and then I enrolled in Oxford, and I went to school here the last year.
Now, was the family in Emily City, did they have a farm as well?
Oh yeah, 160 acres.
So I suppose you pitched in and helped them out now and then as well.
There were always cows to milk. Well, we had a milking machine then. We had 25 cows.
Did that cause a rather unusual relationship between you and your parents, living most of your time with friends and then coming home on the weekends and during the summers, or?
All the time I was growing up, my older brother had been working at the factories in Detroit, Turnstead's, and he and my father on the weekends would always lament that he hadn't gone on to high school. High school was a big thing at the time they were growing up, and that he really didn't get promoted at General Motors as well as he could have if he'd had more education. He was often put up for promotion, but he didn't have education beyond the 8th grade. So, as my brother and I said, we never stopped hearing that we were going to get an education, so just part of growing up. So it was important to get to high school first, and of course then go on to school.
I know you'd have been quite young at the time. I just want to backtrack just a little bit here, but do you have any memories of the Depression?
Oh, yes. I remember how big a nickel was. In fact, I remember my paper route was 12 people, which was 12 cents a day, but that was equal to 2 candy bars. Yeah, that 12 cents was the difference between having money and not money. Yep.
There's two things I've heard people say over and over again about the Depression. One of them is that, yes, we were poor, but so was everybody else, so we didn't notice it.
Oh, you all noticed that, except we were all poor.
Yeah, everybody was the same.
Yeah.
And another thing, the second thing is talking to people who were involved in farming, was the good thing about farming is we had food.
Never went hungry, ever. I've always been thankful for that one. Yes, you're correct. We always had a garden, always had food, always had meat, always had plenty to eat. In fact, helped supply my brother who lived in Detroit.
Yeah.
And of course we had the Depression, we had the rationing during the war, so it was pretty close. Even then, things were better economically during the war, but food was even worse because we had the rationing, you know.
Yeah.
So, but even so, the Depression, I'll tell you a little story. I was out to lunch with my director when I was a resident. In fact, I was older than my directors because I was an older student. And I was out having breakfast, and I said to Irwin, I says, you know, this last piece of toast, I really don't want it, but I'm going to eat it. And he says, well, that tells where you came from, that you couldn't waste it.
That's right.
That was probably the most important thing. You talk to other Depression people, they didn't waste anything. It was too precious.
Yeah.
And, you know, during the Depression days, but dollars were different, but our family of 5 lived on $150 a month for several years, you know.
Try doing that today, huh?
Well, remember, you got to multiply by 50
Sure.
or whatever the inflation
Exactly.
has gone on, you know. So
Yeah.
but it was very close, and you're true. Everybody else was in Depression days, but we all lived that way. When I went to school, there was no athletic programs at all. Yes, in the fall they'd throw a soccer ball out, and there you are, fellas.
Yeah.
Or in the spring you got a baseball,
Big
but you had to have
difference.
your own bats and gloves.
Yeah. Now, you were going to high school while World War II was going on.
Right at the tail end of it, yes.
Yeah.
Well, all through high school, actually, yes.
What kind of stuff went through your mind about the war when you were going to school?
Well, of course, I remember when the war started in '39. I remember when Pearl Harbor. I remember when Hitler invaded Russia. I do remember all of those things. And you know, as a teenager, it was more information. You're not part of it, except when we're older, we're going to participate in it, you know. And, and of course, everybody went to war. Yeah, all the young men, there weren't any left during the war. They were all in service.
How did that impact your focusing on a career choice?
Well, when I was in the service, I had a leg injury from a soccer game, and so I was down to Great Lakes Hospital for a while. And at the time, I got exposed to the doctors there, and I liked what I was seeing done there, especially for the ones coming back from the war with really serious injuries. That ward was full of people with casts and different surgeries, and really quite remarkable. And I think it's probably my first thought that I could really go on to that. Although I started it as an engineer and would have probably stayed as an engineer, except I never handled math that well. And so I was doing well with sciences, do well with history, do well with the rest of it. So then I decided I need to make a different career change. And I thought, well, I'd try business perhaps, and then I didn't care for that. And then just drifted into the sciences and medicine.
Okay.
It's kind of like a stepwise thing, you know.
We're unfortunately running out of time right now, but we got so much more ground to cover, Doctor. I want to talk more about your choosing medicine, how you got involved with that, where you went to school, and so forth. But we're going to have a part 2 to this edition of My Life, and I hope that you'll be able to rejoin us for that. Dr. Charles Williams of Leonard, Michigan and Oxford, Michigan. We're pleased to have him with us. We'll see you next time.
Hey Leonard, you're watching OCTV.